Hey guys, tonight we follow a single message as it leaves a stone hut in the Andes before sunrise, gets tied into a bundle of knotted string, and starts a relay across some of the most punishing terrain on the planet. Carried entirely on foot by young men who trained their whole lives to run themselves half to death for an emperor they would probably never meet. And I'll be honest with you, if you were handed that job tomorrow, in your actual sandals, at actual sea level lungs, you would not make it past the first hill. You'd be lying face down in the grass by the second switchback, apologizing to a llama. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It is not quite light yet when someone shakes you awake. You didn't choose this life exactly, though you didn't entirely not choose it either. Your family owed labor to the state, the way every family did. A rotating tax paid not in coin, but in time and effort. And this year, the labor happened to be you, and it happened to be this: running. You are young, you are fast, and somewhere in the last few years, an official with sharp eyes and a long memory decided you had the legs and the lungs for the roads. So here you are, a relay runner, a chasqui, if you want the local word for it, which loosely means something like the one who exchanges, which is a very calm way of describing a young man about to sprint uphill in freezing air with something important strapped to his chest. The message itself is not paper. There is no paper here, not in this empire, not in this century. What you're carrying is a quipu, a small bundle of knotted, colored cords, tied in patterns that mean something very specific to the person who made them, and the person who will eventually untie their meaning at the other end. You don't necessarily know what it says. That's not really your job. Your job is to not drop it, not lose it, not let it get wet, and not, under any circumstances, arrive later than the runner who left from the station one valley over. Because there's already a rumor, past runner to runner the way rumors are, that a fresher man is stationed a few miles ahead of you, ready and loose-limbed, just waiting for you to show up so he can take this thing off your hands and do the running for a while. It is, in a strange way, encouraging. It is also, in a more honest way, a little bit humiliating. Nobody wants to be the slow leg of a relay before the sun's even up. You eat something quickly, dried maize, maybe a strip of jerky, whatever the station has stocked, because these waypoints exist specifically so runners don't starve mid-shift, a detail we'll come back to. And then you're out the door, and the first thing that hits you is the cold. Not brisk cold, Andes cold, the kind that sits in your chest and makes your first few breaths feel like inhaling a knife. You start moving, because moving is the only thing that will warm you up. And ahead of you, disappearing into a bank of gray cloud, is the road. Now, I want you to actually picture this road, because it is, without exaggeration, one of the more staggering engineering achievements of the pre-industrial world, and it rarely gets the credit that pyramids and coliseums get. Probably because nobody photographs a road as dramatically as they photograph a temple. This is the Qhapaq Ñan, the royal road, though road undersells it a little. It's less a single road than a nervous system, a sprawling network of paved trails, cut staircases, and causeways stretching. By some estimates, somewhere over 30,000 kilometers, threading through desert, jungle, and mountains that don't so much rise as loom. It links the far edges of an empire that, at its height, ran along most of the western spine of South America, without wheels, without horses, and without a written alphabet. Everything that needed to move, armies, grain, textiles, orders, gossip, gods, moved along this thing on human feet or llama hooves. You are, this morning, one very small, very cold component of that system. The stairs start almost immediately. Whoever engineered this section apparently looked at a nearly vertical slope and thought, yes, we can absolutely put a public road there. And so you climb, breath rasping, thighs burning in a way that will feel entirely normal to you by noon and entirely impossible to imagine right now. This is where I'd gently point out, you are doing this in sandals, not running shoes, not boots. Simple sandals, tied with cord, offering approximately the support of a flip-flop and roughly the same amount of enthusiasm for repeated impact on stone. Somewhere in a modern sporting goods store, there is a $200 shoe, engineered with gel cushioning and ankle support specifically to prevent the injury you are currently sprinting toward, on a strip of leather. You'll be fine. Probably. Ask again in 20 years if your knees are still speaking to you. The air itself works against you here too. And this part isn't a joke. This is just physics being unkind. At this elevation, oxygen is thinner than what your body expects, and even people born and raised in these mountains, whose lungs and blood have adapted over generations to pull more use out of less air, still feel the burn on a hard climb like this. You are not local, or maybe you are. Either way, altitude doesn't negotiate. Every runner on this road has felt this exact tightness in the chest, this exact metallic taste at the back of the throat. And every runner has learned the same lesson early. You do not fight the mountain by going faster. You fight it by going steady. Rhythm over speed. It is, in its own exhausting way, the entire philosophy of this job compressed into one breathing pattern. You crest the first ridge as gray light starts leaking into the sky, and below you, the road drops away toward a river you can't yet see but can already hear. A low roar carried up on cold air. That roar means a bridge, and Andean rivers do not do polite, meandering water. They cut straight down through rock in violent, churning drops, which means every crossing point along this network required something clever, because you cannot simply wade across a river trying to kill you at high speed. So they hung bridges. Suspension bridges, woven from twisted plant fiber. Grasses, mostly, braided and cabled together into something that, from a distance, looks almost too delicate to trust, and up close, looks exactly as delicate as it looked from a distance. You reach the near end of one now, and there is a specific, particular moment every runner has that first steps onto one of these things, a half second of your whole body reconsidering its choices. The bridge sways. Not dramatically. The engineering is genuinely sound, regularly maintained by communities whose local labor tax is specifically bridge upkeep, which is its own kind of fascinating, a whole rotating shift of people whose entire civic duty is keep the rope bridge from killing anyone this season. But sound engineering doesn't stop a rope bridge from moving under your feet 100 feet above whitewater, and your body knows that instinctively, even when your brain has done this walk a dozen times before, you don't stop. Stopping on a swaying bridge to admire the drop is how careers end, in more than one sense. You keep your eyes forward, your feet quick and light, and you're across before the fear really has time to finish forming a complete sentence in your head. On the far side, the road keeps climbing, because apparently the person who planned this route considered immediately after a terrifying bridge to be an excellent moment for more stairs. Here's where the morning decides to make things interesting. The sky, which had been merely gray and unfriendly, starts doing something worse. The wind picks up, sharp and needling, and within a few minutes, you're moving through what is unmistakably the beginning of a mountain storm. This is not rare. Weather up here changes with something close to spite, and every runner on this network has, at some point, had to make the same quick, ugly calculation you're making right now. Push forward across an exposed ridge where a slip means a very long fall, or find shelter and lose time you don't actually have, because somewhere ahead a relief runner is standing in a doorway, checking the horizon, wondering where you are. You choose to push. Most runners do, most of the time, because the culture around this job doesn't reward caution, it rewards reliability. And there is a difference. You put your head down, narrow your whole world to the next 10 feet of stone in front of you, and you move. And I want to sit with that for a second, because it's worth noticing what's actually happening here underneath the physical drama. This isn't some ceremonial gesture, some symbolic prestige run for show. This is the actual communication infrastructure of one of the largest states the pre-industrial world ever produced. Somewhere behind you, an order or a report or a piece of urgent news started its journey. Somewhere ahead of you, someone is waiting to receive it, make a decision, and possibly send an entirely different piece of information back down a different branch of this same network. You are, in the most literal sense, a packet of data with legs moving through a system that has no wires, no towers, no satellites, just trained young men, a genius of a road, and an almost obsessive institutional insistence on redundancy and discipline. The storm eases as the trail drops back down out of the exposed ridge into a sheltered valley, and ahead, finally, you see it. A small stone structure tucked against the hillside, smoke curling faintly from somewhere inside, and standing just outside the doorway, already stretching, already watching the trail, with the specific alertness of someone who has been waiting for you to appear, is the next runner. This little way station is called a tambo, and it's worth understanding what it actually is, because it's doing more work than rest stop implies. Spaced out along the road at fairly regular intervals, often somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 kilometers apart, though the terrain sometimes forces adjustments, these stations exist to keep this whole relay alive. They stock food, they stock water, sometimes dry clothing. They shelter travelers of every kind, not just runners. Soldiers on the move, laborers heading to a work rotation, officials transporting goods, because the road serves the whole empire, not just the mail. But for runners specifically, the tambo is the entire structural genius of the system. It's the reason nobody has to run the whole distance themselves. It's the reason this network can move information faster, in some documented cases, than certain postal systems would manage centuries later, using nothing but feet and good spacing. You dig into your chest for the pututu, a trumpet made from a conch shell, blunt and loud, and you blow it as you close the last stretch of distance, a sound built to carry over wind and water and warn the waiting runner that you're close. He steps out to meet you before you've even fully arrived, and for a few strides you're running side by side, matching pace, while you pass him the bundle, the cords. Whatever verbal message travels alongside them, memorized word for word, because memory is also part of the infrastructure here, a redundant backup system running in a human brain instead of on paper. The handoff takes seconds. It's practiced. It's almost gentle for something moving this fast. And then he's gone, sprinting off down the next stretch of road with your message now his responsibility. And you're standing there in the cold, hands on your knees, lungs on fire, watching someone else's turn begin. There's a small, strange feeling that comes with that moment. If you let yourself notice it, you will probably never learn what the message said. You will very likely never meet the person it was meant for, and they will certainly never know your name, or the specific bridge you crossed, or the storm you pushed through to get their words one leg closer to home. Your entire contribution to a piece of history is a few miles of stone road and a couple of pulled muscles. And then you disappear from the story entirely, folded back into the ordinary business of your own life until the next rotation calls you up again. It's easy, from where we're sitting, warm and still, to think of history as something that happens to famous people, in famous rooms, with famous decisions being made. But most of an empire this size runs on exactly what you just did. Thousands of anonymous handoffs, thousands of cold mornings, thousands of tired legs carrying somebody else's urgent news up somebody else's punishing mountain. The emperor at the far end of this chain gets to make a decision, because a chain of ordinary, unnamed young men decided, one leg at a time, not to be the one who broke it. You'll walk back to your station, eventually, once your breathing settles, and you'll wait there again for the next message, the next runner coming up out of the fog, the next stretch of road that needs a body willing to run it. It is, in its own exhausting way, a kind of quiet devotion, not the loud kind history usually remembers. The kind that shows up before sunrise, does the work, and lets someone else's name end up in the record. Because that's the thing about a message like this. It's heading somewhere specific, toward Cusco, toward the throne, at the center of this whole enormous breathing network, where whoever sits on it is meant to receive news like this and answer with the kind of certainty that keeps 40,000 kilometers of road and everyone running on it, moving in the same direction. But thrones are strange things, and the men who sit on them don't always control what happens once the message actually arrives. The message keeps climbing without you, and if you followed it long enough, past station after station, it would eventually arrive somewhere it was never really built to survive. A room full of men who had already decided what the answer should be before they'd finished reading it. By the time our next story picks up, that particular kind of room belongs to Cusco, and Cusco no longer belongs entirely to the people who built it. The young man at the center of this next stretch was never supposed to be a symbol of resistance. If anything, he was chosen for the opposite reason. His name was Manco Inca Yupanqui, and in November of 1533, Spanish conquistadors under Francisco Pizarro placed the royal fringe on his head themselves, in the very city his ancestors had built into the religious and administrative heart of an empire spanning millions of people. They didn't do this out of generosity. They did it because a hollowed-out puppet emperor, sitting on a throne that still commanded genuine loyalty from the population, was a far more efficient tool of control than an occupying army alone could ever be. Let the local population keep their emperor. Let them keep their rituals, their processions, their sense that the old order still technically existed. Just make sure the man wearing the fringe understood, quietly but unmistakably, who was actually in charge. For a while, that arrangement more or less worked, in the narrow, humiliating way that arrangements like that tend to work. Manco performed the rituals expected of an Inca ruler. He processed through the plazas. He accepted the tribute, the reverence, the outward forms of an authority that, underneath the surface, had already been gutted. And meanwhile, the men who'd placed him there treated him with the casual disrespect you might show a useful employee rather than a sovereign. Which is, if you think about it, a genuinely strange way to run an occupation. Imagine inheriting a company, keeping your name on the door and your office at the head of the table, and then watching new management help themselves to the payroll, insult you in meetings, and occasionally lock you in a room when they suspect you're not fully on board with the direction things are heading. That was, roughly, the shape of Manco's daily existence in those first 2 years. The trappings of majesty, none of the actual power, and a rotating cast of Spanish brothers, Hernando, Juan, Gonzalo Pizarro among them, who treated the arrangement as something closer to babysitting an especially valuable prisoner. It got worse before it got clearer. In late 1535, after what the Spanish read as an attempted escape, Manco was imprisoned outright, chained, by some accounts, and subjected to abuses that went beyond simple confinement. We don't need to dwell on the specifics to understand the effect. Whatever illusions Manco might have still held about negotiating a livable position within this new order, that period in captivity seems to have burned them away completely. He emerged in January of 1536, a changed calculation, not a changed man exactly. Just a man who had stopped pretending the math could work out any other way. And here's where it gets interesting. In the way that political theater often does when the person forced to perform it finally decides to write his own script, Manco approached Hernando Pizarro with a proposal that sounded, on its face, entirely reasonable. Let him travel to the nearby UK Valley to perform a religious ceremony, and he would return with a large gold statue as a gift. Gold to conquistadors. It's hard to imagine a pitch better calibrated to get exactly the answer he wanted. Hernando agreed. Manco left Cusco on April 18, 1536, promising to come back with treasure. He had no intention of coming back at all, at least not as a guest. What Manco actually did, once he was out from under Spanish eyes, was gather. Word went out along the same kind of road network you just crossed a valley on. The Qhapaq Ñan, carrying not a single knotted message this time, but the whole apparatus of a call to arms, moving out toward chiefs and warriors and provincial lords across the highlands. Within weeks, the casual, contained emperor, the Spanish believed they'd tamed, had assembled what chroniclers would later describe, with wildly varying numbers depending on who was doing the counting and how frightened they were while counting, as tens of thousands of fighters. Some accounts push the figure much higher. The exact number is genuinely disputed and probably always will be, since every surviving description comes from men with strong incentives to either inflate the threat they'd survived or downplay how badly they'd been caught off guard. What isn't disputed is the outcome. Hernando Pizarro, realizing far too late what he'd actually agreed to, sent his brother Juan with a cavalry detachment to break up the gathering army before it could fully organize. It didn't work. The rebellion was already too large, too coordinated, and too furious to be dispersed by a single skirmish. By May of 1536, Cusco, the same city whose plazas Manco had processed through in ceremonial submission for 2.5 years, was under siege by his own returning army. Picture the scale shift here for a second, because it matters. A few hundred Spanish conquistadors and their allied auxiliaries held the city, dug into its stone architecture and the imposing fortress of Sacsayhuaman just above it. Outside those walls stood a force that outnumbered them by staggering margins, drawn from every corner of a network that, until a few months earlier, had been running smoothly in the emperor's name. Except now that name was pointed directly at the people who'd been exploiting it. It's almost elegant in a grim way. The exact same roads, the exact same relay stations, the exact same discipline that let a runner move a message across a mountain range in days rather than weeks. All of it had just been repurposed from an instrument of imperial administration into an instrument of imperial revenge. The infrastructure didn't care who was using it. It simply moved whatever needed to move, at whatever speed the moment demanded. The siege dragged on through the winter, 10 brutal months of it, and it wasn't limited to Cusco alone. Manco coordinated a second front against Lima, the new coastal capital the Spanish had recently founded, sending one of his generals to strike there in tandem. And for a stretch, several Spanish relief expeditions sent from Lima toward Cusco were intercepted and destroyed outright. A genuinely staggering number of Spanish dead for this early stage of the conquest. Enough that if you'd been placing bets in the middle of 1536 on which side would still be standing by year's end, betting against Manco would not have been the obvious choice. But sieges are strange, grinding things, and momentum has a way of quietly changing hands even when nothing dramatic seems to happen on any single day. Spanish reinforcements eventually arrived from the south under a rival conquistador named Almagro, and their arrival tipped a balance that had been holding, however precariously, in the Inca army's favor. After 10 months of fighting, low morale finally caught up with a force that had been enormous but not infinite, sustained not by a state's granaries and supply lines the way it once might have been, but by whatever provisions an army in open rebellion could still scrape together. Manco made the call to lift the siege and pull back. He didn't simply retreat into the mountains and vanish, though. He fell back first to the fortress at Ollantaytambo, a stronghold with steep, terraced approaches that turned out to be a genuinely formidable defensive position, and there he actually beat back a Spanish assault sent to finish him off. A small, sharp victory in the middle of a longer defeat. The kind of moment that probably felt, in the room, like it might still turn things around. It didn't. Ollantaytambo sat too close to Cusco to hold indefinitely against an enemy that now had the reinforcements and the momentum. And by the following year, Manco made the harder, quieter decision to go further. Not toward another battle, but away from the reach of battles altogether, into the remote, forested terrain of Vilcabamba, where mountains and jungle did what fortress walls no longer could. What he built there wasn't a comeback so much as a continuation, a surviving pocket of Inca rule, a court in exile, operating its own administration, its own rituals, its own chain of command, for years, quietly refusing the ending the conquest had already written for everyone else. It's worth sitting with what that actually meant day to day, because it wasn't glamorous resistance. It was governance under siege conditions stretched out indefinitely. Messengers still running, though a smaller network now, over harder terrain, carrying orders and warnings back and forth between a shrinking court and its remaining loyal territories. The same instinct that built 40,000 kilometers of road to bind an empire together was now holding together a fragment of one, out of pure stubbornness and whatever remained of that original administrative genius. It couldn't last, of course, not against a colonial power with an ocean of resources behind it and nothing but time on its hands. Manco was killed in 1544 in an ugly, almost darkly ironic footnote to the whole affair. Not by the Spanish crown directly, but by a group of renegade conquistadors he had actually sheltered, men fleeing their own political troubles who repaid his protection by murdering him. His son would carry the resistance forward for years afterward, and Vilcabamba itself wouldn't fully fall for decades. But the core of what Manco had tried to hold together, a functioning, independent Inca state with real reach and real legitimacy, effectively ended with him. There's a particular kind of loss buried in this story that's easy to skim past if you're only counting battles and dates. Manco didn't fail because he lacked intelligence, or courage, or the ability to read exactly how thin his position had become the moment the Spanish arrived in Cusco. Chroniclers, even hostile ones, describe a man who understood European tactics well enough to imitate them, who knew precisely which alliances to court and which grievances to weaponize, who very nearly did the impossible with the resources he actually had. He failed because the machine he was fighting had reinforcements crossing an ocean, and his own machine, brilliant as it was, could only ever draw on what already existed inside these mountains. Networks move information fast. They don't necessarily generate more soldiers, more horses, more of the things that a longer war eventually demands. What lingers about Manco's story, more than the sieges or the battles, is the sheer administrative confidence of it. The fact that a man stripped of nearly everything could still, within weeks, summon tens of thousands of fighters across a landscape this unforgiving, using nothing but the same roads, the same relay stations, the same disciplined trust in a system built for exactly this kind of rapid coordination. The empire's greatest strength outlived the empire's collapse by just enough to make one final, nearly successful stand. And then it didn't. Somewhere in all of that fighting, the sieges, the retreats, the desperate coordination between Cusco and Lima and Vilcabamba, messages were still moving the old way, still carried on knotted cords by men trained for exactly this. Orders, troop counts, warnings about where the Spanish cavalry had been sighted, all of it recorded not in ink, but in colored thread and careful knots, the same kind of bundle you carried across that mountain earlier tonight. And that raises an uncomfortable, fascinating question. If the Inca were coordinating a resistance this sophisticated, using their own record-keeping system the entire time, what did those records actually say? What decisions? What fears? What strategy sessions got tied into cord and knot during those 10 desperate months? And how much of it disappeared not because it was destroyed, exactly, but because nobody left alive still knew how to read it? Somewhere in a museum drawer, right now, sealed away from light and humidity, the way you'd protect any fragile, irreplaceable object, sits a bundle of cords that looks, at first glance, less like a document and more like something you'd find at the bottom of a very old sewing basket. Colored strings, dozens of them, hanging off a thicker central cord, each one knotted at various points along its length in patterns that seem, to untrained eyes, almost decorative. A tangle of necklaces, maybe, or the world's most elaborate macrame project, abandoned halfway through. And the genuinely strange part, the part that should stop you for a second, is that nobody alive today can read all of it. Not fully, not with total confidence. We're looking directly at a message, preserved in remarkable physical condition, written in a language humanity has only partially cracked back open. This object is called a quipu, sometimes spelled quipu, and if you want the literal translation from Quechua, it just means knot, which is almost comically understated for what these things actually did. Because in an empire that stretched across 6 modern countries, coordinated armies, taxed millions of people, and, as you now know personally, having run one across a mountain range a couple of stories ago, moved urgent information over some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, the quipu wasn't a curiosity or a ceremonial object. It was the paperwork. It was the empire's entire filing system, its tax code, its census, its inventory ledger, all of it encoded in string. Let's start with what we actually do know, because there's a solid, well-documented core here before we get anywhere near the mysterious edges. Quipus operate, for the most part, on a base 10 decimal system. The same logic you use every day without thinking about it, just expressed physically instead of on paper. Knots tied at different heights along a cord represent different place values. The knots higher up the string carry more weight, quite literally, standing in for tens, hundreds, thousands. The same way the position of a digit in a written number tells you whether it's a 1 or a 10 or 100. Different knot types carry different meanings within that system too. One kind for the numbers 2 through 9, based on how many times the cord loops through itself, and a distinct kind reserved specifically for the number 1. It's elegant, honestly. Once you understand the logic, you can look at a well-preserved administrative quipu and start pulling actual numbers back out of it. The same way an archaeologist might read tally marks on an old ledger, and color meant something too, layered right on top of the numerical system. A cord dyed a particular shade might represent a specific category, a type of crop, a class of goods, a region, a kind of labor obligation, while its neighbor dyed differently, tracked something else entirely on the very same bundle. Imagine trying to read a modern spreadsheet where the numbers are correct, but the column headers were removed sometime in the last few centuries, and all you have left to guess at is the color of the cell shading. That's roughly the position historians are in, with a huge number of surviving quipus. The arithmetic checks out, but the specific of what often has to be reconstructed from context, comparison, and educated guesswork. The people who made and read these things professionally were called quipu cord keepers, essentially, a title that sat somewhere between accountant and archivist and trusted state official. It appears to have often run in families, passed down generation to generation, which meant the skill of reading a given quipu wasn't purely mechanical. There was frequently an oral layer sitting alongside the physical chords, a memorized explanation, a spoken account that gave the numbers their full context. The way a modern accountant might walk you through a spreadsheet rather than just handing you the raw file and wishing you luck. That's actually a small, quiet echo of something you already know from our first story tonight. This empire built redundancy into everything. A message wasn't just the chords in the runner's satchel. It was also whatever he'd memorized to go with them. Belt and suspenders, Mountain Empire edition. Using this system, the state tracked an enormous range of information. How many people lived in a given province, how much maize or wool or coca leaf a region owed in tribute, how many workers had completed their Might A labor rotation, what stood in storehouses along the road network at any given time. It's not an exaggeration to call this bureaucratic infrastructure on a genuinely impressive scale. A governing apparatus managing millions of people, none of it written down in the way we'd normally use that phrase. All of it living, instead, in knotted, colored string, portable, durable, and dense with information, in a way that's honestly a little humbling, once you actually understand what you're looking at. Now here's where the story gets genuinely uncertain, and I want to be careful with how I frame this, because this is one of those areas where the honest answer is simply, we don't fully know yet. For a long stretch of the 20th century, the dominant scholarly opinion was that quipus were purely numerical. Glorified tally systems, essentially, useful for censuses and tribute, and not much else. Clean, tidy, case closed. But more recent research has pushed back on that tidiness, and not without reason. A meaningful portion of surviving quipus, by some estimates, roughly a third of the known collection, don't seem to follow the clean numerical patterns of administrative record-keeping at all. Their knot sequences and structures look different, less like a ledger, more like something else. And that something else is where historians start choosing their words very carefully, because the honest answer is that we don't fully know what these narrative-type quipus were recording. Some researchers suspect certain quipus may have encoded historical accounts, genealogies, even something closer to phonetic language. Chords standing in for syllables or names the way a rebus might, rather than pure quantity. One widely discussed piece of research pointed to a repeating sequence of numbers that seemed to function almost like a location code, potentially marking a specific village, the way a modern shipping label might. It's intriguing. It is absolutely not proven. And you should hear real hesitation in any historian's voice when this topic comes up, because we are, genuinely, still a considerable distance from confidently reading a narrative quipu the way you'd read a paragraph. Why the uncertainty when we can read the numerical quipus with reasonable confidence? A few brutal, overlapping reasons. First, the Spanish, once they arrived and began consolidating control, viewed a lot of quipus with suspicion, as potentially idolatrous objects, tangled up with the very religious and historical memory they were actively trying to erase. And a considerable number were destroyed outright. Second, the handful of quipu readings that Spanish chroniclers did bother to transcribe into their own written accounts don't match up cleanly with any of the roughly 870 quipus that survive today in museum and archive collections. There's no clean bilingual key sitting in some drawer, no Rosetta Stone moment where a known quipu and a known Spanish translation line up perfectly and unlock the whole system at once. Researchers are essentially trying to reconstruct a lost accounting and possibly narrative language using only the internal patterns of the surviving physical objects themselves, cross-referenced against scraps of second-hand, imperfect colonial description. It is slow, patient, genuinely difficult work, and digital cataloging projects. Databases compiling detailed measurements of every surviving chord, knot, and color combination across institutions represent the field's best current hope of finding patterns human eyes alone might miss. So, where does that leave us? Somewhere honest, if slightly uncomfortable. We know quipus were sophisticated. We know they carried real administrative weight, precise enough to run an empire's economy. We suspect, with real but incomplete evidence, that some of them carried something closer to story, history, or memory. And we know with total certainty that we are missing pieces. Some destroyed, some simply lost to time, some sitting right in front of us in perfectly preserved cord and knot, patiently keeping their meaning to themselves. Which brings us back, quietly, to Manco Inca, and to that uncomfortable question sitting at the end of his story. During those desperate months of siege and retreat, orders and reports were almost certainly moving along the relay network in exactly this form. Knotted, colored, dense with meaning to the right-trained eyes. Strategy, casualty counts, warnings, whatever internal record his officials kept of a rebellion fighting for the empire's survival. Some of that material likely didn't survive the conquest at all, burned, lost, unraveled by neglect. But some of it may very well still exist today, sitting uncatalogued or unread in a collection somewhere. Its numbers technically decipherable. Its full context, its human voice, permanently out of reach. Not erased by violence, necessarily, just quietly outlived by the people who once knew how to make it speak. There's something worth sitting with in that gap. We tend to assume that when a civilization's writing survives physically, its voice survives with it. That if the object exists, the meaning exists too, just waiting patiently to be found. The quipu quietly refuses that assumption. It sits there, intact, dense with real information, and reminds you that preservation and understanding are not the same achievement. A message can survive perfectly and still, in every way that matters, be lost. It's a strange thing to think about, an entire perspective on this empire's own history, its own fears, its own version of events potentially recorded in exquisite detail and simply unreachable now. Sitting a few knots away from a meaning nobody currently living can fully unlock. Somewhere in that gap between preserved and understood is the entire other side of every story we've told tonight. Not gone, exactly. Just quiet, and while the quipu Qhapaq sat with their cords in modest offices, counting maize and wool and labor debts for a state that needed every number precise, other quipus, elsewhere in this same empire, were tracking something considerably less modest. Inventories of textiles finer than anything a commoner would ever touch. Storehouses stocked for households where scarcity was a rumor rather than a daily condition. Step through a gateway now, away from ledgers and knotted string, into a household where the numbers on those cords actually became things you could touch. Fine wool, stacked grain, jars of something fermenting in the corner that smells faintly sour and faintly sweet at the same time. You're standing somewhere like an elite compound in Cusco, or maybe higher up, at a royal retreat carved into a mountain saddle, a place like Machu Picchu, built as a private estate for an emperor's own household rather than a city for the general population. And the first thing you notice, walking through it, is how quiet the exhaustion is here. Nobody's lungs are burning. Nobody's checking a storm front against a deadline. The air still has that same thin, clean mountain bite to it, but here it arrives filtered through terraced gardens and stone courtyards instead of through a runner's ragged breathing. What actually strikes you first, though, isn't the architecture. It's the clothing. Because if you'd been told, growing up somewhere else, that gold and silver were the ultimate symbols of wealth in this world, you'd be a little off. Fine textiles held that position instead, genuinely more prized in many contexts than precious metal, which is a strange thing to wrap your head around if you're used to societies that worship shiny rocks above almost everything else. The garments here are woven from vicuña wool, an animal fiber so fine and so difficult to obtain that owning it at all marked you instantly as someone who mattered. And the patterns worked into these tunics, geometric, intricate, called tokapu, weren't just decorative flourishes. They functioned almost like a coat of arms woven directly into the fabric, communicating lineage, rank, and identity to anyone who knew how to read cloth the way a quipu read cord. Status, quite literally, worn on the body. There's a rhythm to daily life here that runs almost entirely on 2 seasons, and it's worth understanding because it shapes everything else. During the rainy months, the household's energy turns toward planting and toward textile production. The patient, skilled labor of spinning and weaving that produced garments like the ones draped over the nobility, walking these courtyards. But during the dry season, the entire compound shifts its center of gravity toward the ruling family itself. Hunting expeditions, religious ceremonies timed to the sun's position, and a kind of curated, deliberate hospitality that would put a 5-star hotel to shame. If 5-star hotels ran on unpaid religious devotion instead of a rewards program, and that hospitality had a signature drink running through nearly every part of it. Chicha, a fermented maize beer, sharp and slightly sour, brewed constantly and consumed constantly, threaded through nearly every social occasion this household hosted. It wasn't just a party favor either. Chicha functioned as something closer to a civic currency of goodwill, offered generously to laborers completing their mite service as both refreshment and a kind of ceremonial thank you from the state, and poured just as generously at religious feasts and noble gatherings where its role shifted from labor incentive to sacred substance, part of rituals honoring the sun and the ruling lineage's divine claim to authority. Imagine your employer's holiday party, except attendance is mandatory. The drinks are considered religiously significant, and skipping it might be read as a political statement. That's roughly the emotional temperature chicha operated at here. Equal parts celebration and obligation, and nobody in the room would have found that combination strange. None of this ran itself, obviously, and this is where the household's actual population gets interesting. You'd notice, moving through the compound, that most of the people actually doing the physical work, the cooking, the brewing, the cleaning, the weaving, the metalwork, weren't nobility at all. Many were Yanacona, permanent servants attached specifically to noble households, a status distinct from the general population's rotating mit-a-labor obligation. Alongside them, in dedicated, somewhat sequestered quarters, lived the Aklakuna, women selected and trained specifically to weave the empire's finest textiles, brew its ceremonial chicha, and perform roles in religious ritual that required a level of skill and consistency ordinary domestic labor didn't demand. Bioarchaeological research on skeletal remains from sites like this has turned up something quietly remarkable too. Isotope analysis suggests a lot of these permanent workers weren't locals at all, but had been brought in from the coast, from distant highlands, from jungle lowlands. An entire imported, specialized workforce assembled from across the empire's full breadth, just to keep one household running in the particular style its status demanded. It's worth sitting for a second with how strange that actually is, once you say it plainly. An estate like this wasn't simply a nice house. It was itself a kind of miniature empire, a hub pulling in specialized labor, rare materials, and constant supply from every direction, exactly the way the empire's capital pulled resources in from its provinces, just scaled down to the size of a single privileged household. And the thing that made that pulling in possible, the thing that let fine cloth and fresh maize and ceremonial goods arrive here reliably enough to sustain this rhythm of feasting and ritual, was the same road network you personally ran across earlier tonight, and the same relay system that carried word of Manco Inca's rebellion, and very possibly the same knotted cords that tracked exactly how much of everything was owed, stored, and consumed. The runner freezing on a mountain pass and the noble drinking chicha in a warm courtyard were connected by the exact same infrastructure. One end was exhausting. The other end was the reward that exhaustion was quietly funding. There's a particular kind of stillness that belongs to a place like this. Engineered stillness, really, deliberately constructed. The water channels running through courtyards here weren't purely functional. Multiple fountains, carefully placed, created a constant, layered burble that architects and later researchers have suggested was partly acoustic design. White noise, in modern terms, meant to soften conversation, mask it from unwanted ears, and generally lower the emotional temperature of the whole space into something calm and unhurried. It's a genuinely clever bit of environmental engineering, and it tells you something about what this household valued. Not just wealth, but the careful, curated experience of ease. Comfort, treated as something worth designing on purpose, the way you might now think carefully about the lighting in a room you want to feel calm in. But stillness like this, however carefully engineered, was never actually self-sustaining. And that's the part worth carrying with you as this story closes. Everything this compound depended on, the maize for the chicha, the raw wool for the tunics, the steady rotation of skilled labor, even the news of what was happening beyond these terraced walls, arrived here along supply lines that stretched back through the same roads and relay stations that made the empire function as a single connected whole. When those supply lines were cut, and they were cut decisively, in the years following the Spanish arrival in the highlands, places built on this kind of curated abundance didn't slowly fade. They emptied fast. Within a generation of conquest, sites constructed to this standard of comfort and ceremony had largely gone quiet, their populations scattered or lost to disease that, in some cases, may have outpaced even the conquistadors themselves in reaching these remote corners. The stillness that had once been a designed luxury became, eventually, a very different and much more permanent kind of quiet. And that's really the shape of the whole night, if you step back far enough to see it. A runner's body driven past its limits on a freezing mountain road. An emperor's careful rebellion built on the very network that had once bound him in submission and lost anyway. A knotted archive that clearly said something and now mostly says nothing, at least to us. And a household of fine wool and warm chicha, insulated from all of that exhaustion, right up until the moment the insulation itself gave out. Different distances from the center of the same enormous, fragile, magnificent system. None of them, in the end, more protected than the roads that fed them. It's strange, when you think about it, how much of an empire this size came down to distance. How far you stood from the center, how fast information could reach you, how much of the exhausting work happened somewhere you'd never personally see. The runner never met the emperor. The emperor never carried a message himself. The weaver in the sequestered workshop never ran the mountain roads. And the person drinking chicha in a warm courtyard never felt the cold stone underfoot at dawn that made that warmth possible in the first place. And yet all of it was the same thread, pulled taut across thousands of kilometers, held together by nothing more solid than discipline, memory, knotted cord, and an enormous collective agreement that the network was worth maintaining. It isn't anymore. Hasn't been for a long time. The roads are mostly quiet now. The relay stations mostly stone outlines in the grass. The knots mostly untranslatable. The courtyards mostly empty of anyone drinking anything at all. What's left is what's always left, eventually, of any vast breathing system of human effort. Fragments, foundations, and the occasional startling reminder that people once organized their entire lives, their entire exhaustion, their entire comfort around keeping something this large moving. You're not running anywhere tonight. There's no message waiting for you at the next station, no storm to outpace, no emperor expecting an answer by morning. Just a quiet room, a soft hum somewhere nearby, and the particular, uncomplicated luxury of not having anywhere else to be. Let the mountain roads stay in the mountains for now. Let the knots keep their secrets a little longer. Somewhere far from here, the wind is still moving over stone stairs that nobody climbs anymore, and that's all right. It doesn't need you tonight. Nothing does. Just the dark and the quiet and whatever's left of the evening, settling slowly like dust after a long day into rest.